Walking with an Armenian is different from walking with anyone else. That's because he will try to catch up with another Armenian. That is, unless you happen to be one. Laughing with an Armenian is different from laughing with anyone else. You know you're laughing because you have survived.
Over 2,500 years ago, in what is today Iran, the Persian king Darius conquered a small nation to the north of his empire, a place he called Armenia. Darius was so proud of his victories that he had an inscription carved into the rock face of a massive cliff.
I am Darius, the great king, king of kings, and these are the countries of which I was king. Elam, Babylonia, Arachosia, Sardis, Armenia.
There were 23 nations in all, virtually all of whom today are gone. But not the Armenians.
The survival of the Armenians as an identifiable group of people with a sense of identity which outsiders perceive is an absolutely amazing achievement and almost unparalleled.
So who were these tenacious people? Where were they from? And why, despite countless other challenges, from invasion to religious war to near annihilation, are they still here?
When you look at what's happened to the Armenians, the sort of catalogue of exile, of deportation, of massacre, there shouldn't be Armenians.
Yet today, Armenians around the world number between 6 and 7 million. They live in a flourishing diaspora that spreads from Los Angeles to Beirut to Sydney. They have their own country and a church that just celebrated 1,700 years of Christianity. So how did they do it?
I adhere to the classical theory that the first speakers of Armenian, first speakers of the language we call Proto-Armenian, migrated across Anatolia sometime in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, from Thrace in the Balkans to the Armenian plateau.
Other scholars argue the Armenians were indigenous, but either way, it was here they met a local people known as the Urartians, who had already established a kingdom in the region.
So the Armenians, when they came to this area, intermingled with the Urartians. And some words in the Armenian language, as it's developed and as it's now attested, are in fact Urartian in origin.
As time passed, an Armenian identity began to emerge. One defined by a legend of migration and a passionate mission of defense and survival.
In the case of the Armenians, somewhat like the Jews, they've been survivors for all of their existence. So the word survival takes on a very great power. The idea of remaining alive in the face of powerful threats of extinction. And it could be that some communities draw upon historical, ancient experiences of survival.
By the years near the time of Christ, Armenian population had become a blend of East and West, of ancient Persian and ancient Greek, a sense of identity so distinct that some of their powerful neighbors saw them as a threat.
Armenians were defined before Christianity as the deadliest enemies of the Roman Empire. The historian Tacitus says that the Araxes, the river that was the symbol that personified Armenia, would never allow any bridges. That is, this was the limit of Roman power. Alexander the Great simply bypassed the country. He never even tried to conquer it. Once he sent 2 generals with orders to request tribute. What the Armenians did was to string them up on the nearest tree.
Despite their developing identity, Armenians lacked religious cohesion. This was because of the many different pagan religions in the region, including the followers of Zoroaster, who worshipped in the fire temples. But these religious divisions soon ended when some years later, Armenians as a nation adopted a new religion. The story of Armenia's conversion, whether legend or true, is certainly epic. In the early 4th century, the Armenian king Turdat, a Zoroastrian, imprisoned a pious and devout Christian monk named Gregory into a deep pit to die. At the same time, Turdat had a beautiful nun named Eurypsime put to death after she refused his advances. But as the story goes, because of this evil act, Turdat was turned into a wild boar. In the meantime, Gregory languished in his dungeon.
We know that in the ancient East, very often prisons were not the elegant affairs that they are today, and that prisoners might simply be cast into a noisome pit where they had to sit in filth and be tortured by bugs and things.
According to the story, Gregory was kept in the pit for 14 years and stayed alive only because a kind woman passed food to him through a secret opening. In the end, Gregory was called to save the king from his porcine fate. Gregory prayed devoutly. The king returned into human form, and to honor this miracle, the king, by decree, converted the entire nation of Armenia to Christianity. The date this conversion took place has been debated for years. Tradition sets it in 301, but some say it could be as early as 284 or as late as 314. Whatever the date, it clearly established Armenia as the first Christian nation on earth.
Հավատքի մեջ ձևավորել է ազգային ոգի եւ ազգային գիտակցություն.
As early as the 5th century, the Christian faith had so penetrated the essence of being Armenian that an Armenian would say that Christianity was the color of his skin and that it was inseparable from his identity.
In a way, every group identity is special, but the Armenians may have their own very special way of being special, that combination of being the earliest Christian nation and being surrounded by alien forces and carving out with enormous difficulty some sense of themselves as a people.
Պատմության մեջ
Our people, throughout history, many times, have been forced to leave their homeland and seek shelters in foreign places. And each time, when they needed to establish themselves in a new country, the first thing they did was build a church, because they have always tied their existence to the endurance of their faith.
This carving is the oldest known Armenian writing. It bears the Armenian woman's name, Ananya, and was carved in the early 5th century in what is today Israel. No Armenian writing exists before the 5th century because until then, there was no Armenian alphabet. When writing was absolutely needed, usually for some official purpose, another script would be used, such as Greek. But this was all to change when a man named Mesrob Mashtots set out to create an alphabet specifically for the Armenian language.
Mashtots was not really from a priestly family. He was from a minor branch of a noble family. He traveled all over the Near East. He collected Aramaic, Greek, Persian models for his script. But what finally pulled these different proto-letters together was a dream he had. He saw the whole thing in a vision where the script engraved on stone came down before him like the 10 Commandments of Moses.
Many believe having a written language helped Armenians to distinguish themselves as a people.
I think that there are some real concrete things that helped Armenians to maintain their identity. One is the alphabet. I think that the Armenian alphabet, the fact that we have our own alphabet, our own language, it's something Armenians cherish. They love the story of Mesrob Mashtots and how he received the alphabet from God.
Soon after, the first book in Armenian script was written. It was, of course, the Bible, and this was followed by numerous illuminated manuscripts.
Written literature has so much to do with cementing a people's consciousness and identity. It really is a way of creating a kind of commonality of mind, soul, and heart.
The Armenian historical texts, which were produced from the 5th century, the 6th century, have become great classics of Armenian historiography, basically define the nation.
But the nation and its Christianity met one of its greatest challenges when the Zoroastrian Persians attacked. The Armenians, led by their general Vartan Mamikonian, lost the battle. But it was, and still is, considered a victory.
The Battle of Avarir in 451 was a battle in which the Armenians demonstrated great heroism against Persian forces. The main thing that they achieved was a memory of heroism and martyrdom for the cause of Armenian culture and Christianity.
We talk about identity loosely. It's become an everyday term in our society. But the term, when thought about, when reflected on, has really powerful connotations for groups, and that's what ethnic wars are all about.
The Armenians wouldn't let go. You know, they wouldn't give up. They were a little bit like the Vietnamese fighting the West. You know, there was just simply, there was going to be no end until the other side went away. And the Persians went away in the middle of the 5th century and left the Armenians to remain Christian.
We can compare the faith of the Armenian people to the firmness of the stones our churches are built on. The loyalty of the Armenian people to Christ, who said, "Build your hope on rocks, so no storm will be able to destroy it."
After the 5th century, Armenian Christianity became further defined when the Armenian Church split from the Western churches, such as the Roman and Greek, because of disagreements over theology.
So Armenian identity meant that their church became a national church and was no longer part of the larger ecumenical church, as it has remained to this day. It is an independent church. It recognizes no authority over its head in this world.
Despite their religious independence, Armenians had achieved limited political cohesion.
Armenia, the geography makes for that. It's a mountainous country. There's snow sometimes 9 months in the year, and two villages 10 miles apart may not be able to reach each other for most of the year. It makes for a lot of dialects, a lot of local customs, but not for any kind of a central state.
Armenians managed, ironically, to survive not so much through unity, but through division. Had they had a unified kingdom and some invader from outside conquered that kingdom, then the whole of Armenia would be gone. But since Armenia was so fractured, so fragmented into different little principalities and kingdoms, it was very hard to conquer all of Armenia. You'd conquer parts of it, but others in another part, in some small mountain fasts, would be independent, would remain free of the control of the great empires.
But in the coming centuries, a new challenge of assimilation would emerge. In the 7th century, a new religion called Islam swept through the Mideast and the Armenian plateau, leaving thousands of conversions in its wake. According to Islamic law, the followers of Islam, called Muslims, were required to tolerate Christians and Jews and not try to convert them. But many Muslims in the region ignored this tenet.
Undoubtedly, many people did convert. We don't know about them because if you leave the church, you've left the community, and there is no record left of you.
Over time, many of Armenia's neighboring countries did become Muslim. But the core of the Armenians resisted, primarily because of their commitment to Christianity. But there were other reasons as well.
What helped Armenian Christians to resist the pressure to convert to Islam was that Armenian society was led by an Armenian aristocracy which very much had a heroic warrior ethos and was interested in resisting attempts at conquest and conversion.
Yet some elements of Muslim tradition and culture did seep into Armenian life.
We start seeing in the sculpture and the representations that the Armenians wear the kaftans and the big turbans of the East rather than Western or Byzantine dress. So physically they begin to look more Muslim, if you will.
By the turn of the millennium, with the widespread Muslim conversions in the region, Armenia had become a small island of Christianity in an Islamic sea. And it was at this point in time when a series of violent invasions began. The first attackers were the Seljuk Turks from the east, who had recently converted to Islam. Led by skilled warrior chieftains, they would raid the cities, killing, looting, and driving Armenians from their homes.
Days of torment came to us, and our cry arose before God. No breath remained within us, and we became lost through our despair. Death grew strong and swallowed us. Joy in our country vanished. Cries of woe arose, and in our dying days there was no time to be healed from the agonies we had already borne.
The Seljuk Turks and subsequent Turkish tribes that arrived did not leave. That became their home because they had moved with their entire tribes, families, wives, children, cattle, flocks, everything.
As more invaders came to the region, so too did more attempts to convert the Armenians to Islam. Many chose death rather than apostasy. Between the 11th and 15th centuries, invader after invader took a turn in the region and on the Armenians. From still more Turkic tribes, to Persians, to Mongols. But the most brutal attacks came when the Central Asian warlord Tamerlane and his armies stormed the Armenian plateau.
More devastation. Tamerlane's invasion completed whatever was standing that was not burned, according to Armenian historians. He destroyed large number of monasteries, burned a lot of libraries, took a lot of Armenian prisoners. And Tamerlane created an empire, but it was a short-lived empire. It was only an empire of Tamerlane. Once he died in 1402, the empire disappeared.
Their fields in ruin, towns destroyed. Some Armenians migrated, and others converted to Islam. But the core of the Armenians remained. In the 15th century, the Armenians were subdued by yet another empire, the Ottomans. But unlike the previous conquerors, the Muslim Ottomans allowed the Armenians to live with some freedom under a system of partial tolerance known as the millet system.
The word millet means religious community. Eventually it would mean nation. Armenians, Greeks, Jews had their own government, so to speak, ruled by a patriarch or the grand rabbi. They had their own rules and eventually even their own constitution. In the Ottoman system, the Muslims were on top and the non-Muslims were on the bottom. Now you could do well. There was some tolerance. People were not systematically persecuted for their religious beliefs. That is, the Islamic view is that people of the book, like Jews and Christians, should be accepted, and if they play by the rules, they should be tolerated.
All we're interested is, at the end, we want peace in your quarter. We don't want riots. We want you to be loyal. You can pray all you want. You can do your own businesses, marry each other, anything you want. Celebrate your Christmases, as long as it's not too loud. Do it in your own quarters. And at the end of the year, give us the 10,000 gold pieces.
Living under Ottoman rule, many say, may have actually helped Armenians survive in some ways.
Historically, Armenians have done much better culturally, politically, economically under Muslim rule than under Christian rule. Mainly because Muslim rule was so foreign that they stuck together. Because marriage to Islam meant leaving your entire community. Basically, as we say in Armenian, they put an X on you.
This system of living under Ottoman control lasted nearly 500 years, with both Ottoman Turks and Armenians absorbing elements of each other's cultures. Although relations were never completely harmonious, the Ottoman Turks, by the early 19th century, referred to the Armenians as the loyal citizens of the empire. The Armenians were successful in business. They had their own political parties. There were even Armenians in the Ottoman parliament. But towards the end of the century, the Ottoman Empire began to decline, and the prosperous Armenians began to lose their status. Then, in the early 1900s, a new regime took control of the Ottoman government, a revolutionary party of militant modernizers called the Young Turks. The party was ruled by three men: Enver, Cemal, and Talat Pasha.
This was the Committee of Union and Progress, which had been in power since 1908. They were secularists, they were extreme Turkish nationalists, and also had a desire to expand eastwards. Now this was obviously a move which was aimed at the heart of the Armenians both of Ottoman Turkey and of Tsarist Russia. They said that they were actually seeking a frontier which would include and unite all branches of their race.
As World War I erupted, the Ottoman Turks, as planned, launched a major military campaign against the Russians on the northeastern front. Armenians found themselves on both sides of that front.
The Ottoman Armenians had agreed to support the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Armenians had agreed to support the Russian Empire.
But since some Armenians in Russia were in fact fighting against the Ottoman Turks, the young Turks feared the Armenians in their own empire might join the Russian enemy. The Ottoman Turks then began a campaign to remove what they considered to be the Armenian threat within their borders.
The entire Armenian community of Anatolia was uprooted and either shot on the spot or driven into the desert to die. The men were driven from their towns and villages and shot a few miles outside, and their bodies were buried in pre-prepared graves. The women and children were forced to walk over the mountains into the deserts and were left to die in terrible circumstances. The authorities said that they were going to new locations, new towns, but these were complete fantasies. They were just dumped in the desert to die.
When I put my head on pillow to sleep, all the past, my life, I remember everything since I've been 7 years old. What I have seen, what cruelty, human to human, I have seen. Never I forget it.
Another eyewitness, Leslie Davis, the United States Foreign Consul in the Harput region of Turkey from 1915 to 1917, documented everything he saw, including an experience at a nearby lake.
That which took place around beautiful Lake Golchak in the summer of 1915 is almost inconceivable. Thousands of Armenians, mostly innocent and helpless women and children, were butchered on its shores and barbarously mutilated.
The Turkish government today denies a genocide took place and lobbies foreign governments and journalists, urging them to express the Turkish side. But when our producers asked to interview a representative of the Turkish government, their spokesperson refused, unless given up to 9 full minutes of uncut and uninterrupted airtime.
To have an entire country, an entire nation, to say it didn't happen, it pains, it's an insult, it's an offense to memory, it's an offense to dignity, it's an offense to humanity, to the humanity of the Armenians.
Today, most scholars acknowledge the history as fact, including this Brown University professor, Engin Akarla, who is of Turkish descent.
We have to put these things in their appropriate historical context. Yes, these things happened.
What are these things?
Genocide, okay? The genocide in the sense that attacks against a distinctive, specific part of the population. In this sense, that's what I understand of genocide, the Armenians. It happened. We need to face it, to understand why it happened, under what circumstances it happened, and what are its moral implications. What does this event tell us about the times? What does this event tell us about great power politics, problems of nationalism in this part of the world? There are many issues that this particular event sheds light on.
Numbers vary as to how many Armenians died, but most estimates fall between 600,000 and 1.5 million.
Let us say it's not 600,000, but 6,000. what difference would it make? The responsibility still holds. Again, that's something that we should keep in mind. It's not a matter of numbers. It is a matter of what happened.
Both France and the European Parliament have officially recognized the events as a genocide, and many feel the Turkish government should do the same.
They would do themselves a favor if they said, well, look, it was a terrible event. We contemporary Turks have nothing to do with it. We separate ourselves from it. We denounce it. It was wrong. We apologize for it. Let's go on as fellow human beings.
I did speak to high-ranking officials in Turkey, and I tried to plead with them to attain reconciliation. And the only way to attain reconciliation is to bring Armenians and Turks together, talk and compare memories, even compare pain. But for strange reasons they refuse, and I don't know why.
Whether they admit to that genocide or not, Armenians are going to go ahead and rebuild that small little bit of country that's left. Armenians are going to go ahead, build their churches and keep on with their communities. It is not going to affect them. They will be jubilant if Turkey does, of course, admit it. But I don't think it's a factor in Armenians getting on with rebuilding their lives.
Milar kurigi manushik shudok patsvi parikaru.
These great-great-grandchildren of the Armenians who settled in Syria after the 1915 deportations are a testament to Armenian survival. At the same time, other Armenians settled on almost every continent, creating a larger diaspora than ever before. But living in other people's countries was becoming familiar to the Armenians. As early as the 4th century, they had made a home in the Holy Land. So devout was their faith that the Muslim leader who controlled the region in the 7th century gave them significant authority over the 2 highest churches in the area: the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where the Bible says Jesus was buried, and the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem, which was built where Jesus' manger stood. Another place Armenians have occupied for centuries is a region in southeastern Turkey that was once called Cilicia. It was here the Armenians met the European crusaders who were heading to Jerusalem.
Catholic crusaders that arrived from Europe, and on their way to the Holy Land, they had to cross the Cilician gates, and here they met Armenians who are not Orthodox, and the Catholics didn't mind that the Armenians had a totally different form of Christianity, because at least they were not Orthodox, they had never insulted the Pope. And so they became very friendly with the Armenians, and thanks to the Crusaders, the Armenians gained a European crown. A new Armenian king, Leo, was crowned in 1199 with the Armenian chief patriarch and the Archbishop of Metz from Europe. So half of his crown was held by the Catholics, half of his crown was held by the Armenian traditional churchmen, and he was crowned as the new king of Armenia.
The tomb of King Leo's direct descendant, King Leo VI, remains in Paris to this day, alongside those of the kings of France. Another foreign land where Armenians have lived for centuries is Italy. In 1698, an Armenian monk from the Ottoman Empire named Mehetar split from the Armenian Apostolic Church and founded a religious order of Armenian Catholics. few years later, he fled from Armenian traditionalists and settled in Venice, where he built a monastery on the nearby island of San Lazzaro. 100 years after that, the English poet Lord Byron studied Armenian with the monks of San Lazzaro. The monastery is still active today. In the early 1600s, one of the largest movements of Armenians to a foreign land took place when the Persian Shah Abbas was at war with the Ottoman Turks. Since wealthy Armenians lived in the path of the invading Ottomans, the Shah, who wanted access to the Armenians' wealth, had an excuse to evacuate them. So by force he moved them from their homes in and around the region called Julfa to an area much closer to his palace. He then had his armies destroy their cities behind them.
Armenian people, dispersed, hungry, thirsty and naked on your way to captivity, you endured hundreds of thousands of ills. Now you must abandon your fathers' and mothers' graves and surrender your homes to others.
The Shah knew he could only benefit from the Armenian wealth and connections if they were still rich and content. So to compensate for having uprooted them, he created a fancy city for them.
They were brought south to his new capital, Isfahan. And across the river from Isfahan, Shah Abbas made a city for them called New Julfa, a city only for the Armenians. Muslims were not allowed to live there, and he built an Armenian cathedral for them. It's the only time in the history of Armenia that a Muslim king, Muslim workers built a Christian church.
To this day, Armenians remain throughout the region, which is modern Iran, with a thriving community of their own. Perhaps the reason Armenians have been able to stay Armenian is because no matter where they've gone, they've been able to adopt a double identity.
The Armenian secret to survival has been the ability to be two people in one place. It's been the ability to be Armenian and hang on to whatever Armenian means for me and pass that on to my kids. And at the same time to be Italian, American, Tajiki, Iranian, whatever else, so that I can make the best of being in that country. Because I'm either there voluntarily and there because I want to make it, or I'm there totally involuntarily and have absolutely no choice but to survive.
One of the interesting things about traveling through so many different Armenian communities in the Middle East and Eastern Europe and then the Soviet Union is that while there's some indefinable essence which is always Armenian, not just a language but something, there's another part of the Armenians which you kind of notice, which is some adoption of the sort of habits and appearance of the host country, if you like. And in Soviet Armenia, they look like good Soviet citizens as well as we Armenians. The Italian Armenians, they talked very fast, they were very sort of demonstrative and wore kind of elegant and colourful clothes. In Eastern Europe and Romania being a sort of Latin culture, Latin language, there's some sort of effervescence there. I met some Argentinian Armenians, and they again were sort of very demonstrative, very musical. They were sort of singing and dancing and stuff.
And there are countless others.
Armenians create Armenia, create their own Armenianness wherever they go. And one example of this is a man in South Africa who lives alone, no other Armenians around him, who felt the need for a church. built his own little church, an Armenian church, in the middle of nowhere.
As Pulitzer Prize-winning author William Saroyan understood, when two Armenians meet anywhere in the world, see if they will not create a new Armenia. The years surrounding the First World War left many Armenians in search of new homes and thousands upon thousands of orphans. Many had been abandoned in the desert after being deported from the Ottoman Empire.
There's something about the physicality of the Syrian desert which makes it evocative. To move out of the fertile regions of Anatolia, full of villages full of walnut trees and wells and springs, down into the Syrian desert in its sort of emptiness, somehow embodied the finality of the massacres and deportations.
But while many Armenians found new homes throughout the world, some chose to remain near the region.
And there, from 1918 to 1920, there was the first independent Armenian Republic, the first state in 500 years. The Republic, sadly, was a land of walking death, of famine, disease, and eventually fell between the twin attacks of the Turkish National Forces under Kemal Ataturk and the Red Army, which came from the north. In December of 1920, the Soviet Armenian Republic was formed in Yerevan. Here was a land of refugees. The population was well under 1 million. The city of Yerevan, which is now the capital of the country, was a town of tens of thousands. At that point, the country needed to be restored. Basically, the 1920s was a period in which this new Soviet government managed to restore and rebuild the economy, to gather Armenians from other parts of the world, the Middle East, and other parts of what is now the Soviet Union, into this small republic. And then, just as the regime was becoming stabilized, Stalin launched the so-called revolution from above, the collectivization of agriculture, which was not popular among the peasants, the forced industrialization of the country. Thousands of people died as a result of this state-initiated violence against the Armenians and indeed, of course, against other peoples of the Soviet Union. Contact with the West was severely limited. Criticism of the Soviet government was impossible. Expressions of Armenian nationalism beyond a kind of ritualistic patriotism were not permitted.
In addition, the Soviets carried out a massive campaign against religion, including Armenian Christianity. Churches across the country were closed. Services ended. Only the Armenian High Church of Echmiadzin and a few select others were allowed to operate openly and only at a minimal level.
Armenians, however, adapted to Soviet life and indeed became one of the more loyal peoples of the Soviet Union. And the Republic became the center of Armenian life, probably in the world. Armenian operas were produced, Armenian film studio, Armenian radio and television studio, newspapers, more books printed in Armenian than ever before in history. More people educated in the Armenian language, an Armenian Academy of Sciences developed, Armenian research science. This was a renaissance in many ways, but again, always within the limits of tolerance of now the Soviet Empire. But the great achievement of the Soviets was they turned a backward, agrarian country into an industrial, urban society that absolutely transformed that society in ways that it can never be reversed.
But in 1991, Soviet rule came to an end, and with it, a new, independent Armenia was born.
At first, there was tremendous optimism among Armenians that they could make a go of it, that Armenia would somehow become the Hong Kong of the Caucasus, that their economy would develop.
But this has not happened. Conflict with its neighbors has led to economic blockades.
Ordinary life in Armenia today is at a very low level. The economy is in shambles. The people are unemployed. I remember saying to some friends, but now you have freedom. Now you have democracy. They said, what kind of freedom do we have? We have freedom from heat. We have freedom from light. We have freedom from work. Now, what kind of freedom is that? So life for Armenians has become materially much worse. There's deep corruption in the country. Everyone knows that everyone is stealing. The sense that we're all Armenians together, surviving, making it through, is also being tattered, torn apart. And that may be the greatest burden that now is placed on Armenian identity.
Since Armenia is in a period of transition, the biggest obstacle is overcoming the old mentality. I feel this needs to be done through reforms, through open politics, through being visible to the world, and finally by applying the models being used by other civilized nations.
I think Armenia and Armenians everywhere are really impatient. We, perhaps because this is a status and independence that we haven't really had, except for a very short period of time, that we want so much for this place, this mythical dream place that's been in our heads for, in songs and stories forever. And so we want it, and we want it tomorrow, yesterday. Tomorrow is already too late.
We are again at a crossroads in our history in Armenia. It's a question mark what the future holds. But if the past gives us some indication of what the future holds, it's that Armenians will find a way out. They will adapt to these terrible conditions as they adapted to other terrible conditions. They'll gather their forces. They'll think creatively about how to live with their neighbors, and they'll make a future for themselves.
This is Nagorno-Karabakh, a region that since 1992 has been ruled by its own ethnically Armenian government. But this area is not in the Republic of Armenia. It lies within the borders of Azerbaijan. It is also a region to which both Armenians and Azerbaijanis claim ownership and have gone to war to keep.
The Armenian people associate Karabakh with their spirit of the struggle for freedom. I think every nation has a similar symbol. Karabakh symbolizes the Armenian people's fight for freedom and independence.
Beginning in 1988, just before the fall of communism, the Armenians, on grounds of discrimination by the Azerbaijanis of Karabakh, held political demonstrations calling for Karabakh to be incorporated into Armenia. These demands led to outbreaks of violence.
It's basically hard to say who fired the first shot, but certainly the Azeris took very forceful action once the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians made it clear that they wanted to have independence. You start to get clashes.
A short time later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Armenians of Karabakh decided they would determine the region's future and voted it a part of Armenia proper. A series of battles and catastrophes followed. By 1992, the Armenians had secured the region from the Azerbaijanis, along with an additional large buffer area. Each country has viable claims to the region. The Azerbaijanis say Karabakh is theirs because it lies within the borders of their country and because it is the homeland of their historic ancestors, a people called the Caucasian Albanians. The Armenian position is that because they have been the majority population in Karabakh for centuries, the land belongs to them. In addition, they assert that since ancient times it has been part of their homeland. Although a ceasefire was reached in 1994, the war caused tens of thousands of casualties and hundreds of thousands of refugees on both sides.
When you get to a stage where people have been killed on both sides, and there's no wrong and there's no right, there's no black, there's no white, and everyone is equally guilty for letting this get out of hand, it becomes incredibly difficult to resolve. And that's where we are now.
This man, an Armenian farmer named Anastas, who lives in the village of Vaskebar, says his best friend of 20 years, an Azerbaijani, fled as a refugee when the fighting began a decade ago. Villages destroyed, waiting to be rebuilt. Families torn apart, struggling to get on with their lives. There are victims and martyrs on both sides. Anastas, meanwhile, says he just wants his friend back. Armenians have survived for nearly 3 millennia, but a question arises. What has actually survived?
Cultures evolve. As we know, for example, the Greeks of the 5th century BC aren't the same Greeks who inhabit the Peloponnesus today. Cultures evolve, and I think that if one were to study the evolution of Armenians on the eastern Anatolian plateau and in the Transcaucasus, and perhaps even in the southern Anatolia region, you would find change and evolution over the course of 2,500 years.
Armenians passed down from generation to generation the idea that there is a people, a unique people, first Christian nation they call themselves, people who have survived, people who have a unique style of painting, of building buildings, a unique sense of their Christian faith. We tell a tale about who we are and who we were. That's what survives. It's not a genetic thing. It's not in the blood. It's in the imagination. Armenians are a people who survive for centuries without a state. These are a people, like the Jews, that survive without that. And that was because we maintained that tradition.
It's trying to define those similarities and differences with every generation that helps us figure out what it is that is intrinsically Armenian. And I think the definition always changes. It seems to me the first thing is this need to hang on to each other, to find some level of commonality. That may be language, it may be food, it may be some musical memory. It doesn't matter what it is. Why do we do it? Because it's what keeps us going, because there really aren't other things.
You know, we're cultural animals. We cannot exist without a connection to culture, some group, something we call our people. It's a shared history that gives one a connectedness.
There's a strong sense of responsibility that comes with an Armenian, one that has ancient roots. There's a feeling that we have propelled a culture for 2,500 years, and we're not going to stop now. We're going to continue the process because we've seen an enormous rebirth in the 20th century, and I should say the second half of the 20th century in particular.
It used to be that 3,000-year-old chain was either going to make it or break it because of me. Either I was going to teach my kids Armenian or nobody else was. Either I was going to continue the Armenian traditions, rituals, or nobody else was, because there was nobody else. There was not a place called Armenia that was guaranteed to do that. On the other hand, that Armenia is not going to continue. It's not going to continue to produce Armenian children living Armenian traditions unless it survives as a country. And for that, I am responsible.
Someone was calling in my dream. Someone was explaining why Armenian children are raised with so much wonder, as if they might disappear at any moment. Someone was explaining why Armenian sons love their mothers to excess, why daughters-in-law are cherished, why mothers-in-law are treasured, why everything is slightly different in an Armenian home, stared at as if it might melt.
Laughing with an Armenian is different from laughing with anyone else. You know you're laughing because you have survived.